The cruelest punishment a father ever inflicted on his daughter was the one that led her to find true love. Confined to a wheelchair, Laura was nothing to her powerful father but a useless, broken doll. So when their ranch was set ablaze, he saved his prized horses and left her to the flames. But this final betrayal wasn't her death sentence. It was her salvation, because the man who pulled her from the inferno was her father's most hated enemy, and the only person who would ever see the unbreakable strength inside the cage. The late afternoon sun baked the dust of the Maverick Ranch into a fine, choking powder that settled on everything, a constant grit against the teeth. From the shaded veranda, Laura watched the heat shimmer above the parched earth, a wavering curtain between her world and the one beyond the reach of her wheels. The chair, a cruel throne of wicker and iron, had been her companion since the fever stole the strength from her legs a decade ago. It was not the chair she resented, but the cage it represented. A cage built by her father's disappointment. Inside the adobe house, through the open window of the study, his voice boomed, thick with whiskey and impatience. Tuco, the kid maverick, a man whose reputation was as vast and unforgiving as his lands, was speaking with his foreman. Laura's hands, resting limply in her lap, tightened into fists. She knew she should wheel herself to the far end of the porch to escape the words that were like stones cast at her soul, but she remained frozen, a moth drawn to a flame that had only ever burned her. "It's another expense is what it is," Tuco growled, the sound carrying with brutal clarity on the still air. "Doctors, special tonics. For what? She just sits there, a beautiful china doll with a crack right down the middle. Useless for marriage, useless for work. She's a punishment, a constant drain on the fortune I've bled for." Each word struck Laura with the force of a physical blow, eroding the fragile defenses she rebuilt each morning. She closed her eyes, the familiar shame washing over her, cold and heavy. He did not see a daughter. He saw a flawed asset, a line item in a ledger book bleeding red ink. The will to push back, to argue, to even weep, had long since withered under the relentless heat of his scorn, leaving only a hollow ache where her spirit used to be. The heavy oak door of the study groaned open, and Laura flinched as if a hand had been raised against her. Her father emerged onto the veranda, his foreman, a grizzled man named Silas, trailing in his wake. Tuco Maverick was a bull of a man, wide-shouldered and thick-necked, his face weathered by the sun and darkened by a perpetual scowl. He reeked of whiskey and leather, a scent Laura associated with anger and power. He paused at the railing, squinting into the blood-orange light of the setting sun, his gaze sweeping over the ranch hands who were now moving with a grim purpose she had not seen before. Men were cleaning rifles in the yard, the metallic snick-clack of bolts and levers a new, ominous rhythm in the evening air. "They burned the old Miller place," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "Ryder just came in. Said it was Apache. Drove off the stock." Tuco spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Savages," he snarled, the word a venomous curse. "They're getting bold. The army does nothing, the settlers keep pushing in, and we're caught in the middle. Double the watch on the north pasture. I want every man armed, even the cooks." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the dull fog of Laura's shame. This was not just talk. This was the prelude to bloodshed, a tension that vibrated through the very planks of the porch beneath her chair. She watched her father, a man who met every problem with the hammer of his will, and a desperate idea took root in her heart. She could not ride, she could not shoot, but she could think. She had spent endless hours studying the maps of the ranch, her mind tracing the lines of fences and waterways in a desperate attempt to feel a part of the world she could not touch. Wheeling her chair forward, the wicker creaking in protest, she cleared her throat. "Father?" Tuco turned, his eyes narrowing, annoyed by the interruption. Her voice was thin, but she forced it to remain steady. "The plans for the new irrigation channel. I was looking at the survey maps. If you divert it from the San Rojo Creek behind the ridge, instead of across the open basin, it would be less vulnerable. The men would be working under the cover of the hills, and the water source would be harder for anyone to find or poison." For a fleeting instant, a flicker of surprise crossed his face. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and a fragile hope fluttered in her chest. Perhaps now he would see. He would see the mind that still worked, the daughter who cared for the fate of their home. Then, he let out a short, brutal laugh that shattered the hope into 1,000 pieces. "Maps," he scoffed, turning back to Silas as if she were a fly he had just swatted away. She sits here all day, looking at maps, and thinks she knows how to fight a war. A war isn't lines on a piece of paper, girl. It's blood and dirt. It's for men who can stand on their own 2 feet. He gestured dismissively toward her chair. This is what weakness gets you. Caution is just a pretty word for fear. You stick to your charts and your daydreams, and leave the running of this ranch to me. His back was a wall, shutting her out completely. The foreman, Silas, gave her a brief, pitying glance before following his boss down the steps. Laura remained, utterly still, the sun dipping below the horizon and plunging the world into long, menacing shadows. The scent of gun oil now drifted on the evening breeze, mingling with the dust and despair, and she felt the cage around her grow smaller, darker, and more escape-proof than ever before. The night did not fall. It was torn open by a single, high-pitched cry that sliced through the twilight. It was a sound not of this world, a war cry that seemed to rip the very air apart, followed instantly by a cacophony of thunderous hooves and the sharp crack of rifles. The men cleaning their guns in the yard were caught in a whirlwind of violence. Laura saw one of the cooks fall, a red flower blooming on his white apron, before the world descended into a blur of smoke, dust, and screaming. The Apache had come. Through the chaos, her father burst from the stables, his face not of a commander, but of a panicked animal. His eyes, wild and wide, swept past the house, past the veranda, past her. "The horses!" he bellowed, his voice raw with terror and greed. "Get the breeding stock to the South Canyon, run them, leave the rest." He saw her then, his gaze snagging on her for a single, awful moment. In his eyes she saw no flicker of concern, no paternal instinct, only a cold and brutal calculation. She was an anchor, a dead weight in a storm. He turned his back on her, his flight a final, unspoken confirmation of every cruel word he had ever uttered. He was leaving her to burn with the life he had deemed worthless. The betrayal was so absolute, so profound, it stole the very breath from her lungs, a wound deeper than any flame could inflict. The fire caught the dry timber of the veranda with a hungry roar, devouring the cage she had inhabited for a decade. The heat was a physical blow, blistering her skin, the smoke a thick, acrid blanket that filled her throat and made her eyes stream. The world became a swirling vortex of orange and black, the sounds of battle fading beneath the deafening crackle of her burning home. She was truly alone, abandoned in her throne of wicker and iron, a useless doll left behind in a house of fire. Her terror gave way to a strange, hollow resignation. This was the end her father had chosen for her. From the swirling heart of the inferno, a figure emerged. He was not a ranch hand coming to her aid, but a specter from her father's darkest curses. An Apache warrior, his bare chest slick with sweat and streaked with paint, his face a mask of fierce concentration framed by long black hair. His dark eyes, ancient and intelligent, swept over the chaos before landing on her. This, she thought with a final, shuddering gasp, was death. He moved with a predator's grace, the firelight glinting off the rifle in his hand. But when he reached her, there was no killing blow. The man, Geronimo, a name whispered in fear across the territory, simply stopped. He looked from her face to the useless wheels of her chair, then to the collapsing roof above. In his gaze, there was no pity, but a flicker of understanding, an acknowledgement of a vulnerability that transcended the battle. He barked a sharp command in a language she did not know, and then, with a strength that seemed impossible, he leaned down. His arms, corded with muscle, slid beneath her, lifting her from the chair as if she weighed nothing. The shock of being held, of being moved, of being saved, was so jarring it silenced her terror. As he carried her away from the inferno, away from the ruin of her father's legacy, she looked up at the weathered face of the man her world had branded a savage. He did not see a cracked china doll. He saw a human being in the path of a fire. And in that simple, profound act of protection, a strange and tentative peace began to settle in her soul, a quiet dawn breaking over the ashes of her old life. The world was a dizzying canvas of motion and shadow, the rhythmic gait of the horse beneath them, the only constant in the disorienting flight. Laura clung to Geronimo's chest, the smell of sweat, horse, and smoke filling her senses, her cheek pressed against the hard warmth of his skin. The jolting journey ended abruptly as they passed between two monolithic rock formations that seemed to swallow the moonlight, plunging them into a deeper, more profound darkness. They had arrived in a hidden place, a wound in the earth's crust. Fires flickered ahead, casting dancing shadows against the walls of a narrow canyon. The air grew thick with the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat, a stark contrast to the acrid smell of her burning home. Voices murmured in a language that rose and fell like the wind, punctuated by the occasional bark of a dog or the soft cry of a child. Geronimo dismounted with fluid grace, lifting her down and carrying her toward the largest of the fires. He laid her gently upon a thick buffalo robe spread on the ground, the coarse fur a strange comfort against her soot-stained dress. For a moment, she was merely an object of curiosity. Faces, illuminated by the firelight, turned toward her. The eyes of women, children, and old men took her in, their expressions a mixture of surprise and deep, ingrained weariness. Then, a warrior, his face a mask of hard lines and fresh grief, stepped forward. He spoke to Geronimo, his voice a sharp, angry torrent of words, his hand gesturing not toward Laura, but toward the dark canyon mouth from which they had come, the direction of the white man's world. He was Chato, a man who had lost a brother only a week past to a patrol from Fort Bowie. He saw in Laura not a person, but a symbol, a disease brought into their sanctuary. She was a liability, another mouth to feed, and worse, a potential trail for the soldiers to follow. Geronimo listened, his expression unreadable as stone. His gaze remained fixed on the fire, but his mind was a storm of ghosts. He heard Chato's words, and they echoed the vengeance that had been his constant companion since the day he returned to his own camp to find his wife, his mother, and his children all slaughtered by Mexican soldiers. That fire of hatred had forged him into the warrior he was. Yet, as he looked at the white woman, at her frail form and the useless legs tucked beneath her, he did not see a soldier. He saw a captive, like so many of his own people. He saw the ashes of a home, a sorrow he knew intimately. To kill her would be to feed the fire that consumed him, but it would not warm his people. It would be an act of weakness, an imitation of the very cruelty they fought against. He spoke, his voice low but carrying an authority that cut through Chato's anger. The words were quiet, measured, yet they silenced the camp. He was not arguing for mercy, but for strategy, for the soul of the people. To harm the helpless, he explained, was to surrender a piece of their own spirit to the enemy. She was not a warrior. She was proof of their enemy's own weakness, a man who would abandon his own child to the flames. They would watch her. They would learn, but they would not become the monsters they fought. Chato fell silent, his jaw tight with dissent, but he stepped back into the shadows. Laura, who had understood nothing but the raw emotion of the exchange, finally let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She had been certain she was about to die. Instead, an older woman with kind, weary eyes approached her. Without a word, the woman knelt and offered a simple clay cup filled with water. The gesture was so unexpected, so devoid of the pity or condescension that had colored every act of charity in her life, that Laura could only stare. Her hand trembled as she took it, the cool clay a shock against her skin. The water was life itself, washing the smoke and dust from her throat. As she drank, she watched a small boy tumble nearby, and a man she did not know scooped him up, brushed the dirt from his leggings with a gentle hand, and sent him on his way. It was a small, unthinking act of communal care, as natural as breathing. In her father's house, such a child would have been scolded for his clumsiness, his value measured against his potential for error. Here, he was simply a child, a part of the whole. A quiet, revolutionary thought began to surface through her fear. For the first time in a decade, she was in a place where her brokenness was not the sum of her existence. It was merely a fact, like the color of her hair, or the smoke clinging to her clothes. The days that followed were a trial of grit and shame. The Apache camp, a sanctuary carved from the unforgiving rock, was not built for wheels of iron. Each attempt Laura made to move from the buffalo robe where she slept to the communal fire was a battle against the land itself. The wheels of her chair, designed for polished floors and smooth verandas, caught on every stone, sank into every patch of loose sand, and grated against the rugged earth with a sound that seemed to mock her with every turn. The simple act of traversing 20 yards left her arms aching and her spirit raw, each snag and jolt a fresh reminder of the helplessness her father had so despised. One morning, the familiar humiliation became acute. A wheel lodged fast in a fissure between two flat stones, refusing to budge. She pushed, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her knuckles white. The more she struggled, the more firmly she became wedged. Around her, the life of the camp flowed on, the women grinding corn, the men checking their weapons, their movements fluid and certain. She was an island of ineptitude, a broken piece of the white man's world, useless even here. A hot flush of shame crept up her neck, more painful than the strain in her shoulders. Geronimo saw it all from the shadows of an overhang where he was sharpening a knife. He watched her futile struggle, the tension in her jaw, the tremor of frustration in her hands. He saw not the white woman Chato saw, but the cage. He understood cages. He gave a quiet, guttural command, and a young warrior, lean and sharp-eyed, broke from his task of fletching arrows. With a glance that held more duty than sympathy, the warrior came to her chair, dislodged it with an effortless heave, and pushed her the remaining distance to the fire. Laura murmured a thank you, but her heart sank. She had merely traded one form of dependency for another. Later, as the sun began its descent and the canyon walls glowed like embers, Geronimo approached. He carried 2 long, slender poles of pine, stripped of their bark, and a length of rawhide. He did not speak to her, did not even meet her gaze, but knelt beside the chair. Laura watched, mystified, as his hands, which she had only seen holding a rifle, began to work with a craftsman's quiet focus. He used his knife to notch the poles, his movements economical and precise. He fashioned a simple, sturdy cross-brace, lashing it to the poles with the rawhide, his knots swift and sure. He was building a travois, a drag sled of the plains, but one ingeniously adapted for her. When he finished, he rose and, with 2 more strips of hide, secured the frame to the back axle of her chair. He then gestured for her to try. Hesitantly, she pushed the wheels. The poles behind her slid over the rough ground, distributing the weight, gliding over the stones and sand that had trapped her before. It was not effortless, but it was possible. She could move. She could navigate her own world. She looked at him, her throat tight with an emotion she could not name. It was not pity that had driven him to this act. Pity was a soft, condescending hand. This was different. This was the work of a mind that saw a problem and devised a solution. He had looked at her, truly looked, and seen not a broken woman, but a person in need of a better tool. It was an offering of respect, a quiet acknowledgement of her will to move, a gesture of profound and practical kindness her own father had never been capable of. A single, hot tear traced a clean path through the soot on her cheek, a drop of salt water in a desert of grief. Geronimo saw the tear but turned away, granting her privacy. As he walked toward the canyon's rim, a strange calm settled over him. The ghosts of his slaughtered family were always with him, their whispers fueling the fires of his vengeance. Chato and the others saw only the enemy, a symbol to be hated. But in the simple act of shaping wood and hide, in freeing a captive from her prison of iron, he had found a moment's respite from that consuming heat. It was an act of creation in a life defined by loss, a small but undeniable counterweight to the darkness. And for a moment, the warrior felt the quiet solace of a man who had built something, instead of tearing it all down. The travois was freedom, but it was a freedom that came with a price. Every journey across the camp floor was a study in the immense labor of survival. Laura watched the Apache women dig for edible roots, their tools nothing more than fire-hardened sticks, their backs bent under the relentless sun. She saw men scrape hides with sharpened stones, a task that took 3 of them a full day for what a single ranch hand with a steel fleshing knife could accomplish in an afternoon. Her world had been one of tools and leverage, of harnessing the power of iron and engineering to bend the land to her father's will. Here, the only engines were sinew and bone, and a profound, unyielding patience she had never known. This observation slowly burned away the residue of her shame, replacing it with a burgeoning sense of purpose. Her mind, so long turned inward on her own misery, began to work again, tracing patterns and seeing solutions. One afternoon, she watched 2 women struggle to shred the tough, fibrous leaves of a yucca plant to make cordage. They beat the leaves against a rock, a slow, punishing process that frayed their hands as much as the plant. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear, watching the ranch hands use a simple lever press to crush sugarcane for molasses. The principle was the same: force multiplied. Her heart hammered against her ribs. To speak would be to risk the same brutal dismissal her father had dealt her, to be reminded of her place. But to remain silent felt like a betrayal of the flicker of respect Geronimo had shown her. Taking a steadying breath that tasted of dust and wood smoke, she wheeled herself closer, the poles of her travois whispering over the ground. Using a shard of charcoal, she began to sketch in the dirt. A long log, a stone for a fulcrum, another rock lashed to the end as a weight. She pointed from her drawing to the yucca leaves, then mimed the pressing motion. Chato, his face a permanent thundercloud, strode over. He spat a torrent of harsh words, kicking dust over her drawing. The meaning was unmistakable. The white woman's tricks were poison. They had survived with the ways of their fathers. They did not need the tainted knowledge of their enemies. But the older woman, whose name she had learned was Taza, knelt and studied the diagram. Her brow furrowed, not with anger, but with contemplation. She saw the logic, the simple physics of it. A quiet but intense debate began between her and Chato, their voices a counterpoint of cautious curiosity and bitter distrust. From the shade of a juniper tree, Geronimo watched the scene unfold. He saw not an enemy teaching his people, but a mind offering a tool. He had watched her for days, seen the intelligence in her eyes as she absorbed the rhythms of their life. When he looked at her, at the fierce concentration on her face as she tried to explain her drawing, he was struck by a memory of his wife, Alope. She had possessed that same quiet ingenuity, the ability to see a better way. The memory was a knife twisting in a wound that never healed, the phantom scent of his wife's hair, the echo of her laughter as she taught their children. His hatred for the world that had stolen them from him was a fire that banked but never died. Yet, in this white woman, he saw not a soldier, not a settler, but the ghost of that same creative spirit. To crush it would be to spit on Alope's memory. He approached the small group, his presence silencing the argument. He looked at the drawing in the dirt, then at Laura. His gaze held the vast, empty plains of his loss, but also a flicker of something new. He spoke to Taza, his voice low and devoid of command. He did not order her to try the device. He simply acknowledged the idea's merit and affirmed her wisdom to judge it. Turning his back, he walked away, leaving the decision in their hands. As Laura watched Taza and another woman begin to search for a suitable log, a warmth spread through her chest, fragile yet fierce. It was the first ember of a fire she thought had long gone cold, the feeling of being not just seen, but heard. The news arrived with a scout, his horse lathered and his words breathless. A cavalry patrol, 30 strong, was combing the foothills, their route taking them directly toward the Sweetwater Spring, the only reliable water source for miles and a crucial stop for the Apache before any long journey. Chato's hand went immediately to the knife at his belt, his eyes glittering with a predator's light. To him the news was not a threat, but an opportunity, an ambush, a chance to spill the blood of the blue-coated soldiers who had killed his brother. The warriors gathered, the air growing thick with a grim, electric anticipation. Laura, sitting near Taza, felt the shift in the camp's spirit like a change in barometric pressure. This was the moment she had feared, the inevitable collision of two worlds. But within the fear, a different instinct stirred, born of her newfound sense of purpose. An ambush was a hammer, and she had learned in her father's house that a hammer sees every problem as a nail. To fight for the spring was to announce their presence, to turn this hidden canyon from a sanctuary into a target. With her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, she pushed the wheels of her chair forward. The travois slid smoothly over the packed earth. Chato saw her coming and sneered, but she addressed her words to Geronimo. "An attack will tell them you are here," she said, her voice clear and steady. "They will return with more men. They will not stop until they have scoured every rock." She picked up a stick and began to draw in the dust. "Do not fight for the water. Make them believe there is no water to fight for." Her sketch showed the spring, then a series of channels dug above it, lined with cured hides she had seen stored, designed to divert the flow just beneath the surface. The spring would appear to have run dry, a common enough occurrence in this parched land. Chato kicked dust over the drawing. "A woman's trick," he spat. "The trick of a coward. We are Apache. We do not hide from these dogs." The ghosts in Geronimo's mind screamed in agreement. The lust for battle, for the righteous fury that was the only tribute he could pay his murdered family, rose like bile in his throat. This was the moment he lived for. Yet he looked from Chato's face, contorted with a familiar hatred, to Laura's, illuminated by a fierce, clear-eyed intelligence. Her way was not cowardly, it was clever. It was the way of the coyote, not the bear. It was a strategy of preservation, not annihilation. He gave a single sharp command. They would try the white woman's plan. As dusk fell, they waited, concealed in the rocks, high above the now barren-looking spring. The silence was absolute, broken only by the wind whistling through the crevices. Then came the faint, rhythmic drumming of hooves. The patrol appeared, their blue uniforms stark against the red earth. They rode to the spring, dismounted, and cursed as they found only damp mud. After a few minutes of fruitless searching, their officer gave a frustrated command, and they rode on, swallowed by the growing twilight. A collective, silent sigh of relief passed through the hidden warriors. Not a shot fired, not a man lost. Later, as the fire danced and painted their faces in gold and shadow, Geronimo came and sat on a rock near her chair. The vast, starry sky opened above the canyon like a spill of diamonds. "A good plan is a weapon that does not bleed," he said, his voice a low rumble. Laura felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "My father thought my plans were the daydreams of a crippled girl. Useless." Geronimo looked at her then, his gaze direct and piercing, tracing the line of her jaw, the flicker of the fire in her eyes. In his world, a person was what they could do, and she had saved them. He saw not a crippled girl, but a mind as sharp as any flint blade, a spirit that had not been broken. "Your father was blind," he said simply. For the first time since the fever had stolen her legs, Laura felt a sensation so foreign it startled her. She felt beautiful. Not pretty like a china doll, but powerful and whole, seen and valued for the very part of her that had been most scorned. He had done more than save her from a fire. He was saving her from the ashes of her own shame. As he looked away, back toward the constellations, Geronimo felt a profound stillness settle in his soul. Vengeance had offered him no victory today, but her quiet wisdom had. It was a strange and unsettling peace, a path he did not know, but one that, for the first time, seemed to lead somewhere other than a grave. The truce of the desert was fragile, a thin skin stretched over a boiling pot of grief and rage. Chado's voice, sharp as obsidian, sliced through the evening air as he argued for a raid on a new supply wagon rumored to be crossing the plains to the south. He spoke of vengeance for his brother, for every Apache slain by the white man's relentless advance, his words a drumbeat of war that resonated in the hearts of the younger warriors. They saw weakness in waiting, dishonor in hiding. They craved the release of battle, the cleansing fire of righteous bloodshed. From across the fire, Geronimo listened, his face a mask of stone, but his soul was a battleground. Every instinct honed by years of loss screamed to join Chado's call. The ghosts of his wife and children whispered to him, demanding retribution, their spectral hands pushing him toward the familiar path of violence. Yet another voice, quieter and more recent, counseled a different way. It was Laura's voice, her logic echoing in his mind. A plan that does not bleed. To raid the wagon was to bring the hornet's nest of the army down upon them. It was a fool's errand born of pain, not strategy. Laura felt the tension coil in the pit of her stomach. She watched Taza and two other women return from a deep cistern at the far end of the canyon, their shoulders bowed under the weight of heavy, water-filled hides. The journey was short but arduous, a constant, grinding expenditure of energy. Her mind, once a prison of self-pity, now saw only problems to be solved. An idea, simple and elegant, took shape. Using charcoal on a flat piece of sandstone, she sketched a design. 2 long poles forming a handle, a cross-brace for support, and a single, sturdy wheel at the front. It was a wheelbarrow, a device of such rudimentary utility in her world that it was almost invisible. Yet here, it would be a revolution. When she showed her sketch to Taza, Chado strode over, his shadow falling over the drawing like a curse. "More white woman toys," he snarled, his lip curling. "We have backs for our burdens." But Geronimo, who had been watching from the shadows, stepped into the firelight. He looked not at Chado, but at the drawing, then at the weary slump of Taza's shoulders. He gave a single, quiet nod. It was permission. The next day, as the crude but functional cart made its first trip, carrying 4 water skins with the effort it once took for one, a quiet murmur of approval rippled through the camp. It was more than approval. It was respect, a tangible acknowledgement of a mind that worked for the good of the people. That night, the air was cool and smelled of juniper and dust. Geronimo found her by her sleeping robe, staring up at the river of stars. "The cart is a good path," he said, his voice a low rumble beside her. A sad smile touched Laura's lips. "My father would have called it a frivolous waste of time." She paused, the words tasting like ash. "He once told me that my mind was like a broken clock. Pretty to look at, but it couldn't tell the time that mattered, the time for bearing sons and running a household." Geronimo sat on a nearby rock, the silence stretching between them, thick with understanding. He did not offer condolences. He offered a piece of his own brokenness. "My wife Elope," he began, his voice rough with disuse. "She wove patterns into her baskets that told the stories of our people. The elders said it was not the way of the ancestors. They said a basket is for carrying seeds, not stories." He looked at Laura, his dark eyes reflecting the distant starlight, and in them she saw a desolation that mirrored her own. They did not see that the stories fed the spirit, just as the seeds fed the body. When the soldiers came, they burned the baskets first. The admission hung in the air, a confession of a pain so profound it transcended language. He was not just a warrior, he was a widower who missed his wife's art. She was not just a cripple, she was a thinker whose value had been denied. In the shared darkness of the canyon, under the silent witness of the stars, two spirits, scarred by the careless cruelty of their worlds, found a fragile, unspoken freedom. The freedom of being seen for what was essential, not for what was broken. The attack came not with the thunder of a war cry, but with the sharp, unexpected crack of a single rifle shot that echoed from the canyon's mouth. It was followed by the angry buzz of a ricochet off stone and the panicked cry of a woman. Laura, who had been watching Taza's son, a small boy named Noko, chase a lizard near the rockfall, saw him freeze, a small, terrified statue in the sudden, violent silence. Two white men, prospectors by the look of their dusty clothes and stubborn determination, had blundered into the canyon's entrance, their fear instantly curdling into aggression. Chato and two other warriors melted into the rocks, their movements economical and deadly, but the prospectors were desperate, firing wildly. One of their bullets kicked up dust scant inches from Noko's feet. Taza screamed his name, but was pinned behind a boulder. For a heart-stopping second, Laura was back on the burning veranda, frozen by terror. But this was a new fire, and she was no longer the same woman. The shame was gone, burned away, and replaced by a fierce protective instinct. Her arms, conditioned by weeks of forcing her chair across the unforgiving ground, bunched with muscle. She shoved the wheels forward, the travois poles scraping a frantic rhythm against the dirt. The 20 yards separating her from the boy felt like a mile. Every push a monumental effort of will against the screaming fear in her own mind. From his vantage point, Geronimo saw it all. His mind was a cold, clear instrument of battle, calculating angles and exposures. But his heart was a chaotic storm. He saw the prospector reloading, saw the child, and then saw Laura, a flash of soot-stained calico, propelling herself into the line of fire. A terrible possessive fury seized him. He fired once, a shot of perfect, lethal precision that dropped one of the men. But the other panicked, raised his rifle, swinging it toward the bizarre sight of the wheeled chair. Time seemed to slow. Geronimo didn't think. He moved, a specter of vengeance covering the ground with a predator's speed. He was on the man before the hammer could fall, the butt of his rifle striking with a brutal final crack of bone. The fury of it, the satisfying crunch, was a familiar poison, a brief hot solace for the ghosts that haunted him. When the dust settled, the canyon was deathly quiet save for Noko's terrified sobs. Laura had reached him, pulling his small, trembling body onto her lap, her own heart hammering against her ribs. She was not a rescuer. She was a shield, and in that act she felt a rightness, a sense of purpose that resonated to her very core. Geronimo approached, the rage receding from his face, leaving behind a profound self-loathing. His violent rage felt clumsy and profane next to her quiet courage. He knelt, not looking at her, but at the child she held. His hand, large and still streaked with the grime of the fight, reached out and gently brushed a tear from Noko's cheek. Then his gaze lifted to hers. In his dark eyes, she saw the storm of his inner battle, the killer and the protector, the grieving widower and the man who was beginning, against his will, to feel again. He said nothing, but the fierce, raw gratitude in that look was more intimate than any touch, a silent confession that he had feared not just for the child's life, but for hers. The weeks that followed the prospectors' attack settled into a rhythm of quiet healing, both for the canyon and for the spirit within it. The simmering tension that Chato perpetually stirred was banked, for a time, by the stark memory of Laura's courage and Geronimo's swift, decisive violence. An unspoken peace held sway, fragile as a desert flower but beautiful in its brief blooming. Laura found her days filled not with the aching idleness of the veranda, but with the small, essential tasks of life. She mended torn leggings with a bone needle, her stitches small and neat, and she helped Taza sort dried herbs, her mind a keen catalogue of their properties. One evening, as the fire painted the canyon walls in hues of molten gold, Taza approached her. The older woman's face, a beautiful map of hardship and resilience, was lit with a soft, solemn light. In her hands, she held nothing, yet she carried the weight of a formal pronouncement. She knelt before Laura, an act that silenced the nearby conversations. "The people have seen you," Taza said, her voice clear in the still air. She spoke her own language first, the words musical and resonant, before translating for Laura's benefit. "You do not have the legs of the deer, but you have the heart of the mountain lion who protects its young. You do not have the arms of the bear, but you have a mind that builds and saves. We will no longer call you the white woman. Your name is Ijido Trili." She paused, letting the name settle. "It means strong wheel." The name struck Laura with the force of a physical touch. Strong wheel. It was not a name of pity that ignored her chair, nor was it a cruel mockery of it. It was an acknowledgement of her reality, transformed from a symbol of weakness into a mark of honor. Her father had seen a broken thing, a flawed piece of machinery. Taza and the people saw an engine of will and intellect. Tears welled, hot and thick, but they were not the familiar tears of shame. They were tears of gratitude, washing away the last grimy traces of her father's scorn. Later, when the moon was a silver sliver hanging in the ink-black sky, Geronimo came to her. He moved with his usual silence, sitting on a flat stone near the buffalo robe, where she lay watching the stars. For a long while, he said nothing. The only sound, the gentle hiss of the dying campfire. "Chato still believes the only path is the one paved with blood," Geronimo said at last, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. "For a long time I believed it too." He stared into the darkness, but Laura knew he was seeing ghosts. "After my family was killed, my rage was a shield. I led raids for vengeance when we needed food. I chose battles that cost us warriors when we should have preserved our strength. I called it honor, but it was just a wound that I kept tearing open, hoping it would bleed on my enemies." He turned his head, his gaze finding hers in the gloom. "Your way, the plan for the spring, it was the way of a true leader. It fed the people. My way only fed the graves." The confession was a profound offering, a piece of his soul laid bare. Laura's heart ached with a tenderness she had never known. "My father thought I was useless because my mind worked on things he couldn't understand," she whispered. "He saw my ideas as a flaw, a weakness, because they were not his kind of strength." Geronimo looked from her face to the chair beside her. He reached out, his calloused fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second, before they came to rest on the iron rim of the wheel. He did not push it or inspect it. He simply touched it, a gesture of profound intimacy and respect. It was the wheel that had carried her into the line of fire for Noko. It was the wheel that had carried her across the camp to share her ideas. It was her. In his dark, weary eyes, she saw the reflection of the stars, and for the first time, she felt their light was shining for her. The kindness was so stark, so pure against the backdrop of her past. It felt like the first true breath she had taken in 10 years. He was not just seeing her brokenness, he was honoring her strength, and in his touch, in the quiet space between two scarred souls, something new and fragile began to grow, taking root in the ashes of their old worlds. The news came on the back of a winded horse, a single rider appearing at the canyon mouth like a dark premonition against the bleeding sunset. He did not slow, urging his exhausted mount through the familiar passage until he slid to a halt in a spray of gravel and dust near the central fire. The scout's face was a grim mask of exhaustion, his chest heaving. The quiet hum of evening life, the murmur of conversation, the crackle of cooking fires, the soft laughter of a child, died instantly, replaced by a tense, waiting silence. "Tuco Maverick," the scout rasped, his voice raw. "He rides with 30 men. hired guns from the territory. He tells the soldiers at Fort Bowie that his daughter has been taken captive, and he's coming to reclaim his land from us. The scout's gaze flickered to Laura, a brief, sharp glance that felt like a brand. He says he's coming for you. The name, Father, struck Laura with the force of a physical blow. For a dizzying moment, she was back on the veranda, the world shrinking to the confines of her chair, the air thick with the scent of whiskey and scorn. The old shame, a cold and greasy serpent, coiled in her gut. He was coming, not to save a daughter, but to reclaim an asset, to polish his reputation by rescuing the helpless captive he had left to burn. His arrival would not be a salvation, but an annihilation, a dragging of her soul back into the cage she had just begun to escape. Her hands, resting on the iron wheels of her chair, tightened until her knuckles were white. The name Taza had given her, Strong Wheel, felt like a mockery in the face of this old towering terror. Chato's reaction was immediate and visceral. A low snarl escaped his lips, and his hand closed around the hilt of his knife. Let him come. He spat, his voice ringing with a savage joy. Let the great Tuco maverick water the rocks with his own blood. We will make a monument of his men's bones. Several younger warriors echoed his sentiment, their eyes lighting with the familiar, hungry fire of battle. They began checking their rifles, the sharp, metallic snick-clack of the mechanisms slicing through the twilight, a sound that promised death. Geronimo stood apart, his face unreadable as a river stone. He heard Chato's call to war, and the ghosts within him stirred. The warrior, forged in the fires of unimaginable loss, felt the pull toward that glorious, simple release of violence. To meet force with force, to answer the white man's aggression with a storm of Apache fury, it was the path he knew, the language his grief understood best. His very sinews hummed with the desire to lead the charge, to feel the satisfying recoil of his rifle, to wash the land clean with the blood of his enemies. Yet, as his gaze fell upon Laura, upon Iji-do-tri-il-i, a dissonant chord sounded within him. He saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it, a new, hard-won strength. He saw the mind that had diverted the spring, the heart that had shielded a child. Her way was not the way of the bear, charging blindly into the fray. It was the way of the coyote, clever and patient, a strategy that preserved life rather than one that merely honored death. To fight Tuco Maverick here, at their sanctuary's door, was to fall into a trap of his own making. It was Chato's way. It was his own old way. And as he looked at Laura, watching him with a desperate, silent plea in her eyes, he felt the profound weight of his choice. The warrior who had lost everything was now faced with a decision that could save what little remained, or sacrifice it all on the altar of his own rage. The fire spat and crackled, a nervous heart in the center of the tense circle of warriors. Chato paced before it, his words a lash of hot wind against the cooling night air. He brings his paid killers to our home. We will meet them in the canyon mouth and send their souls to the dust. We will show this Tuco Maverick what it costs to hunt the people. A guttural cry of agreement rose from the younger men, their faces grim and eager in the flickering light, the scent of gun oil and righteous fury thickening the air. They were sharpening blades on whetstones, the grating sound setting Laura's teeth on edge, a terrible music that was the prelude to bloodshed. Each word of Chato's speech was a stone thrown at the fragile new house of her soul. She could feel the walls trembling. Her father was coming, and with him, the ghost of the woman she had been, a creature of shame and silence. To fight him was unthinkable. To return to him was a death of a different kind. Her gaze darted to Geronimo, who stood near the edge of the firelight, his profile carved from shadow and sorrow. The ghosts were on him again. She could see it in the rigid set of his jaw, the way his hand rested near the hilt of his knife. He was a warrior, and a warrior's blood answered the call to battle. She feared that in his rage against the white man, he would forget the woman who stood as a symbol of them. But she was Iji-do-tri-il-i, Strong Wheel. The name was a shield, and she raised it against the tide of her own fear. Pushing her chair forward over the packed earth, she cleared her throat, her voice cutting through Chato's tirade. A fight in the canyon mouth is what he expects, she said, her voice shaking only slightly. It is a trap. He will pin you here. Chato whirled on her, his face a mask of contempt. And what is your plan, white woman? To draw him another picture in the dirt? Ignoring him, she looked directly at Geronimo, her eyes pleading with him to see beyond the bloodlust. Your scouts are your eyes, but they are burdened. They carry water, a rifle, ammunition. With a piece of charcoal, she sketched on a broad, flat stone. She drew a smaller, lighter version of her travois, designed to be pulled not by a chair, but by a single man. Cover these with hide and brush, she explained, her hand moving swiftly. They will glide over the rocks, carrying supplies without noise. Your scouts can move faster, range farther. They can watch my fa, watch Maverick's men. Lead them away from here, harry them from a distance. Bleed them slowly, without ever giving them a battle to fight. Taza, who had been listening intently, nodded. The mind that saved the spring speaks wisdom again. It is the wisdom of a coward, Chato roared. Geronimo finally moved, stepping into the full light of the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face, illuminating the war within him. He looked at Chato, and in his eyes was the deep, weary understanding of a shared path of grief. He felt the pull of that simple, brutal honor. Then his gaze shifted to Laura. He saw not a white woman, but his strategist, his strong wheel, her face pale but resolute, her mind a beacon in the storm. She offered a path that led to tomorrow, while Chato's led only to a glorious, final grave. He raised a hand, and the camp fell silent. His voice, when he spoke, was not the roar of a war chief, but the low, certain command of a true leader. "We will make the sleds," he said. His eyes found Laura's across the fire, a silent promise passing between them. He was choosing her. He was choosing life. In that moment, amid the smell of smoke and the threat of war, the quiet space between them became the only true sanctuary in the entire unforgiving land. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the red rock and baking the air until it shimmered. Tuco Maverick and his 30 hired guns were a dark stain on the landscape at the canyon's mouth, a line of simmering violence and steel. The jingle of their harnesses and the nervous stomp of their horses were the only sounds that dared to challenge the profound, waiting silence. From the deep shadows of the entrance, the Apache watched, unseen but for the occasional glint of a rifle barrel catching the light. Tuco spurred his horse forward, halting in the space between the two worlds. He was a man swollen with rage, his face a purpled thundercloud. "I've come for what's mine," he bellowed, his voice echoing unnaturally against the stone. "Send out my daughter. I'll not have her living in filth with you murdering savages." His eyes, small and hard, scanned the shadows, searching for his property. He felt only fury, a righteous indignation that a man of his stature should be so inconvenienced. He was not here to save a daughter. He was here to erase a humiliation. From the heart of the shadows, Laura moved. The scrape of her travois poles on the stone was a quiet, deliberate sound. She emerged into the brutal sunlight, not as a captive cowering, but as a woman claiming her ground. For a heart-stopping second, the sight of her father, so large and full of his familiar contempt, threatened to shrink her soul back to the size of a withered pea. The old fear, cold and slick, slithered up her spine, but then she felt the hard iron rim of her wheel beneath her hand, and Taza's voice echoed in her mind. "Strong wheel." The fear receded, replaced by a resolve as solid as the canyon walls around her. "I am not your daughter," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying with a startling clarity that cut through his bluster. "The woman you called daughter died in the fire you left her to." Tuco stared, his mouth agape. This was not the broken china doll he remembered. This was some other creature, her back straight, her gaze level and unafraid. "What madness have they filled your head with?" he snarled. "You'll come with me now. You are a maverick. You are my blood." "My name is Iji Dotril-E," Laura stated, the Apache words feeling more true on her tongue than her own given name ever had. "These are my people. This is my home. You offer me a cage of gold and pity. They have given me a life of purpose and respect. I choose purpose." Chato, his face alight with a dark fire, stepped beside her, his knife in hand. "Her words are spoken. Now you will leave, or you will die here." Geronimo emerged last, moving with a fluid stillness that drew every eye. He positioned himself slightly in front of Laura, a living shield. The warrior within him screamed for battle, for the simple, bloody satisfaction of wiping this arrogant white man and his hired killers from the face of the earth. It was a familiar hunger, a comforting rage. But then he looked at Laura, at the unyielding strength in her jaw, and he felt a different kind of power. She had offered a path that did not lead to more graves. She had offered a future. He would not sacrifice that future for the ghosts of his past. He met Tuco Maverick's furious gaze, and for the first time in years, felt no need for vengeance, only a profound and weary clarity. He gave a quiet, guttural command. Without a sound, the warriors around them began to melt back into the deeper recesses of the canyon, not in retreat, but in a strategic disappearance. They were denying Tuco his fight, his glorious rescue, his very reason for being here. They were simply choosing to live. As Laura wheeled her chair to follow them back into the cool dark, she cast one last look at the man who had given her life, only to tell her it was worthless. He sat upon his horse, sputtering, defeated not by arrows or bullets, but by a strength he could not recognize, and a love he had never known how to give. The canyon swallowed her up, and in the quiet space between her and Geronimo, a new world began. The journey to the high country was an exodus of quiet determination. They moved not like a defeated band in flight, but like a people purposefully relocating to safer, more fertile ground. For Laura, the travois Geronimo had built for her chair was no longer a mere tool, but a part of her. The poles whispering over pine needles and rich earth, a sound that spoke of progress and belonging. They settled in a valley cradled by towering peaks, where a clear, cold river tumbled over smooth stones, and the air smelled of damp soil and evergreen. Here, life was not a battle against the parched rock, but a partnership with the land's abundance. Laura, now consulted as a matter of course, sketched designs for irrigation channels to water gardens of corn and squash, and her mind, once a gilded cage for her misery, became the clan's most valued resource for building a resilient future. One evening, as the setting sun painted the undersides of the clouds in shades of rose and lavender, Geronimo watched her from a distance. She was laughing, a sound he had never heard from her before, as she showed Taza's son, Noko, how the leverage of a stick could move a stone too heavy for his small arms. The warrior in him, the man forged in the crucible of loss, felt a profound and unfamiliar peace. His rage had been a fire that consumed everything, even his own people's hope. He had honored his dead with more death, but her quiet wisdom had shown him another way. Iji do Triili, his strong wheel, had taught him that the greatest victory was not in the number of enemies slain, but in the number of children who laughed in the twilight. Later, when the camp was aglow with the soft light of cook fires, Taza led Laura to the central clearing. A finely woven blanket, rich with the dyes of berry and clay, was spread upon the ground. Geronimo was waiting, his face serene in the firelight. This was not a ceremony of ownership, not a contract sealed by a bride price. It was something far deeper. Taza spoke in the Apache tongue, her voice a warm, steady current in the cool night air. She spoke of two paths, both scarred by hardship, that had converged to create a new, stronger trail for the people to follow. Geronimo knelt, not with the deference of a supplicant, but with the steady grace of an equal. He offered Laura his hand. As her fingers laced with his, calloused and strong, she felt the last icy phantom of her father's shame dissolve into nothing. She was not a flawed asset being claimed, but a cherished partner being chosen. He did not lift her from her chair, for he knew her strength resided there as much as anywhere. Instead, he simply met her gaze, his dark eyes holding a universe of loss, resilience, and a love that was as quiet and profound as the star-filled sky above. "My home is with you," he said, the words a vow that sealed the wounds of both their pasts. And Laura, her heart full, knew she was finally where she belonged, her value measured not by what her body could not do, but by the fierce, bright spirit he had seen from the very start. The years spun by, measured not in the bitter turning of a calendar's page, but in the patient cycles of the high valley. The corn grew tall in the fields irrigated by channels Laura had first sketched in the dust, their design a testament to a mind her father had deemed useless. Her name, Ijidotri Li, was spoken with the same casual respect as the names of the mountains that cradled them. The ghost of the girl on the veranda had long since faded, replaced by a woman whose sense of belonging was rooted as deeply as the ancient pines. One evening, as twilight drew a cool, purple veil over the world, she sat watching the children, Noko among them, now a lanky youth, chase fireflies near the riverbank. The air was sweet with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. A profound, quiet joy settled in her heart. a feeling so constant it had become as natural as breathing. Geronimo approached, his steps silent on the soft ground. The fire of vengeance that had once consumed him now banked to a warm and steady ember, the glow of a protector, not a destroyer. He looked at the peaceful valley, at the woman who had shown him that a leader's greatest strength was not in his capacity for war, but in his wisdom to build a future. He came to a stop beside her chair, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder, a gesture of quiet, constant companionship. "The scouts say the soldiers move farther south each season," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They chase ghosts." Laura placed her hand over his, her skin against his calloused warmth. "We are not ghosts," she whispered, her gaze sweeping over the home they had made. "We are here." He had rescued her from a fire, but she had saved him from the ashes of his own rage. In her father's world, she had been a broken thing. Here, in the arms of the man her world called a savage, she had been made whole. This, she knew with a certainty that filled her soul, was the truest meaning of freedom.